Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. Macro Hive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Peter. It's great to have you on the podcast show.
Bilal, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Now, before we get into the heart of our conversation, I did want to ask you something about your origin story. What did you study at university, and was it inevitable you'd end up in economics and policy?
So basically, I wound up in economics and policy owing to the three greatest mistakes I made in my life. The first one was entering high school, and I insisted on taking geology instead of biology, which all the other college-bound students were taking, but I was very stubborn and I ignored everyone's advice, and they were right and I was terribly wrong. And that kind of led to a teenage angst of being behind my peers and so on. It kind of tilted me away from natural science. So that was my first big mistake. In college, I got really interested in economics and did really well. And my second huge mistake was to apply or attend a PhD program in economics without knowing what that was all about. And so I got to Stanford, and it was very different than what I had imagined. So I really didn't do my homework very well. Where I went to undergrad, the economics faculty was very, let's call it left-wing alternative economics, Marxists slash versions of that. And I sort of thought economics was a way to make the world a better place, and it wasn't about math and equations and things. And so I thought, well, this is great. Let me continue to do this, thinking I would be trained to be an economist, right? As opposed to what it turned out, I realized is training you to do research and train the next generation of researchers. So basically teaching you how to be a teacher for teachers, and the typical sort of, I guess, the way the academy, the traditional academic world is, right? We're kind of involved in raising the next generation of scholars and advancing the science as opposed to actually practicing economics. And my background was, my grandfather, one was a plumber, one was a waiter in New York City. They obviously didn't go to college. My parents didn't go to college. My sister was the first one in the family to graduate from college. So I think I would have been much better off going into going to law school to practice law, not to be a professor of law or, a doctor, you go to practice medicine, not to teach medicine. So I guess that was my big mistake, not kind of researching and understanding what I was getting into. And I did have an interest in doing sort of alternative economics. So at Stanford, where I wound up going, there were two professors that from a distance sounded great. One was a guy named John Gurley, who was a former kind of traditional economist who went rogue, and turns out he didn't have anything to do with graduate students. Like, he would teach the Economic 1 class at Stanford to the undergrads, and there's a great class, everybody loved it, but he kind of had turned his back on academic economics, so he had nothing to do with the graduate student. The other professor was a guy named Donald Harris, and I thought, okay, let's see what he's all about. And he was all about sort of matrix algebra and linear programming and sort of proving that, in a planned economy, you could replicate the price system mechanism and so on. So it was all about kind of studying linear algebra, and I thought it was dreadfully boring, and I couldn't care less about this. So I was really stuck, in a sense that the two options were absolutely not of interest. Small side note, probably none of your viewers or listeners or yourself probably have ever heard of Donald Harris or know what he looks like. But I'm almost certain that every single one of your listeners and viewers and yourself No, his daughter, Camilla Harris, is the vice president of the United States.
Oh,
So,
wow. Okay. Yeah, I do know her.
yes. Of course, I don't even think she was born then when I was there. But that's a small sort of curious fact. So that's her father was her father was a professor at Stanford, a sort of Marxist economist who, if my friend's memory is a bit better than mine, he actually used to drive around campus in a gold Mercedes convertible with the vanity plate Das Kapital. So,
Nice.
Anyway,
Well, it would have been quite a sight.
yeah, I think in her biography, you probably hear much more about her mother than her father, who was probably much more influential in raising her. But that's kind of the side story. So my third big mistake was not leaving Stanford after the first year, which was a disaster. Not a complete disaster, but super disappointment and very difficult. So I stuck with it. I think that was a mistake. And regardless of what you think of the outcome, you can't judge a decision based on the outcome. You judge a decision based on the information you had at the time and that. So I'm not saying that it's just because it might have turned out well. They still were all bad mistakes. Those three bad mistakes. And then I had sort of the good fortune maybe from there, which after I got my degree, I was put rightfully in not an academic spot, but at the IMF. And that I have no regrets about. I learned a tremendous amount there. I was practicing economics as opposed to teaching about it. And I learned a lot from my colleagues who were really practitioners, not theorists. So I was never in the research department at the IMF, well, apart from about 6 months. But I wasn't doing the research I did at the IMF was kind of in my spare time.
And you spent quite a while at the IMF, didn't you?
So it was about 25 years. But one of the really good things about the IMF, which was, let's say, a good decision, was that I was told that you can jump around and do a number of different jobs at the IMF. You're not sort of stuck doing the same thing. And that turned out to be true, and that was a great thing. So I spent time in the Middle East department. I spent time in the Fiscal Affairs department. That's where I started off. Then I went to the Monetary and Capital Markets department, which was where I ended my career as head of the central banking division. I took 2 years off and I was at the World Bank. I took a year off and I taught at my old undergraduate school, where I confirmed that I didn't want to be an academic. I was happy to come back to the IMF. And I spent 3.5 years as what is called the resident representative of the IMF in Bulgaria, during a very interesting time from 97 to 2001. So there, basically, you are alone in the country and getting to know the country and the policymakers, the politicians very, very well, that you never do from headquarters. And that was probably the most, I would say, productive part, or the fascinating part, was to really be on the ground. And you are, legally or technically ahead of a diplomatic mission, which is just slightly below an ambassador. So you also have a different sort of lifestyle that middle-class kid from New Jersey.
First of all, if we start with, say, the Fed as our kind of the sort of leader of the pack, so to speak, how would you rate the monetary policy that the Fed implemented immediately after the global financial crisis? Was the policy they implemented, was that the appropriate thing, or did they go too far?
My first macro class at Stanford, which was a good experience, was also the first macro class taught by a young assistant professor who was actually at a business school. His name is Ben Bernanke. Maybe you've heard of him.
I think I've heard of him. Yeah.
So I had very, a bit biased, because I thought he was a great teacher and I respected him. smart guy and a really decent person as well. I may be biased, but I think what the Fed did was very appropriate under the circumstances it was under. And one of the, if we talk about the Lehman thing, which is very controversial, right? The U.S. did not have an adequate framework for resolving situations like that, and I think Ben, in some point, raised that point, and I think the U.S. was not alone in that, and that's really a great emphasis of the Basel Committee and the Financial Stability Board since the Great Financial Crisis, is to really, improve not only regulation supervision, but the resolution framework. So we had this gap in the US between the Treasury and the Fed, and, what can the Fed do and what should the Treasury do? And that was not a good situation to be in. So let's put the Lehman aside and say, in terms of credit easing and large-scale asset purposes, and I want to say, as far as I know, and I've been told by people at the Fed, then Bernanke never used the term quantitative easing while he was at the Fed. Never once.
What terms did he use?
Credit easing. Credit easing is what it was called. And my joke was, well, I knew that Bernanke was not going to call it quantitative easing, because quantitative easing is what the Japanese did, and it didn't work. So even if they were doing the same thing, he wouldn't make the mistake of calling it the same thing. But they weren't doing the same thing, and he called it.
Just to be clear, in terms of terminology here, what were the Japanese doing, or what were the Japanese doing back then that was called quantitative easing?
Right, in the 1990s. So it was a good name for what they did. So they literally had a target for the increase in the monetary base. So a quantitative target for the increase in the monetary base. That was the policy. Okay. So the Fed never had a target for increasing the monetary base, never had a target for really the amount of assets it was going to buy. It announced, programs of buying assets, but it never had a preset number. Okay, we're going to do this or that. And the point, and I think it was very clear, and Don Cohn was the vice chair of the Fed, very clear that monetary aggregates didn't matter to the Fed before, during, or after the GFC. It was all about what's called credit easing. It was all about, we were at the zero lower bound. We're trying to lower interest rates. So we're kind of stuck at the zero lower bound at the short end of the curve. We're going to buy long-term assets to push down long-term yields. We're going to take risk out of the financial market and put it on the Fed's balance sheet. And, that is going to have a ripple effect on lowering the yields on all assets. And, it's kind of conventional interest rate management, just you're doing it at a longer maturity that you hadn't been doing before, because you were able to do what you had to do with the short-term money market with very small interventions. So that was the kind of the Fed's and all the central banks' philosophy was, yeah, we're going to let the Treasury and the market determine the yield curve, except for this overnight rate. We're going to control that, and it's going to go through, expectations and so on. There's a theory of why that should be transmitted across the yield curve, but we're not going to directly do that. Okay, so I think it's very important. And, I'm not sure we were going to get into this, but I think it's almost tragic that economists, the media, have lumped all the different central bank policies under one name, and it's absolutely terrible mistake, because Bank of Japan did something different than the U.S. UK did something different than the U.S. Norway did something different. Australia, Canada, they're different. And if we lump them all together, how can we discuss what worked and what didn't work, and analyze it properly. So that's one of my big things. That's why I make this point about I don't like to use the term quantitative easing, because it doesn't enable you to discuss
And out of interest,
the key differences between, even the Fed, what it did. First it was QE, then the next round, which was different, it was too cute to pass up. It became QE2, right? And then a QE infinity, as if they were all the same. And they absolutely weren't the same. And now we're facing the same thing with quantitative tightening, right? It's QT. But this is being done in a very different way in the US, in the UK, New Zealand, Australia. It's kind of tragic because you say, oh, what is QT and how can we assess it? You know what I'm saying? You have to look at
and in
these.
terms of language, then, I mean, what did Yellen use, and what does Powell use?
Well, I know that Bernanke, since he's left the Fed, has started using the QE term. And I think it's an acceptance, and it's an acceptance of, I'm a big fan of the philosopher Wittgenstein, and he says, words don't have intrinsic meanings. They mean what society defines them to mean, right? But if you're a scientist, let's pretend that economics is a science. You cannot allow sort of popular opinion to define, the concepts you are. Like, we can't, kilo has to be a kilo, right? We can't, accept that, people might use the language and sort of, come up with a hazy notion of what the kilo is. No. We have to stick to scientific definitions. And if we're going to discuss this analytically and scientifically, we need to agree among ourselves. Like, economics should have a separate language from the common language, right? To a certain extent. And we have to stick with more precise terms. But I think what central bankers who have to communicate with the public, at some point you have to give up and say, well, yeah, for example, you were saying, what did they call it? And I'm kind of shocked. So at some point you're saying, like, you're saying, you could say credit easing or CE, but people will think, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
The
point well taken. And actually, maybe what we can do then is let's look at the policies they implemented as COVID, immediately after COVID. How would you describe the policy there? So we can't use the word QE. I mean, what were the array of policies, and how would you score them? Like good, bad, and then...
Right. So I would, again, analytically, right? In QE, it doesn't matter whether you're buying treasuries or equities or MPS, right? QE. So when I look at what any central bank does, I break it down. So in this, let's say there are 4 separate elements that I would like to talk about. The first is the Fed's buying of treasury securities, and broken down into, let's say, in 2020, from the start of the pandemic to, let's say, the end of June 2020, and after that period. So let's say the real crisis period, and then the period after that. Spoiler alert, what they did in the crisis period, thumbs up. Perfect, great. After that, big mistake. Now, the other two elements in the matrix are the MBS purchases. Again, during the crisis period, which, let's call it the classical market disruption period, and then the more, let's say, large-scale asset purchases period. Again, absolutely okay with what the Fed did up through, say, the end of the second quarter of 2020. Beyond that, big mistake. So let's start with the Treasury security purchases. So how do I really see what happened there? I know the Fed called it, intervening to market disruption, and it's the classic lender of last resort. I really think if you step back from it, the Fed provided a huge amount, I'm talking about trillions of dollars, of direct financing to the United States Treasury. Okay. Now you could say, oh, that's terrible, monetary finance. No, we don't do that. Well, this was an absolute, unprecedented crisis. It was like a war. Came out of nowhere. I mean, a war that came out of nowhere. Most wars come out of somewhere. This was literally instantaneous. And you didn't know what the fiscal consequences would be, but the government was committed to probably spending trillions of dollars, shutting down the economy, what it did, right? And remember, one of the first things that Mnuchin did was postpone the tax payment dates from April 15th and I think they were postponed again. So you could see that the Treasury was going to have a huge financing shortfall and a huge spike in spending. So in that context, I'm completely in favor of, the central bank with a lot of credibility saying, look, we're going to help you finance this huge amount of expenditure, like pre-finance. Okay.
And I guess because it's the central bank's credible and it's a temporary step, you wouldn't classify this as modern monetary theory or MMT.
No. And if we have time, I'll go into why it's so important that a country have a well-developed domestic debt market to have that credibility. And one of the fascinating things in my lifetime that I witnessed were countries like Chile, Peru, Mexico, Brazil, Israel, who in the 1980s, when I started working at the IMF seriously, they had no domestic debt, right? If you remember, this was called, in the theory, the original sin, right? So these countries had a choice, foreign financing or monetary financing. There was no domestic debt market. Okay. Now, that's what, the Latin American debt crisis, the Asian crisis, they all immediately led to inflation, depreciation, because foreign financing was cut off. There was a fiscal crisis. And everyone knew, well, there's only one way the government can keep going, and that's central bank print money. But what's happened in the last, 20, 25 years, you have countries like Brazil, all the countries that I mentioned before. Now they have really well-functioning domestic debt market, much to their credit. And I would say, I think the IMF and World Bank helped with that a lot. And so,
and they're in local currency as well, those markets.
Absolutely. They're a local currency and nominal, right? Not index. Yeah. Some are indexed, but a lot of them are nominal. So I like to say to people, who are proposing monetary finance, modern monetary theory, I'm saying, well, look around and see what happened. What do you think would have happened if the pandemic had hit in the 1980s in all of those Latin American countries? You had instant hyperinflation, right? Instant. What happened? You didn't have inflation. You didn't have inflation at all. And these countries were able to issue long-term debt, even though in Peru there was a terrible political crisis. There were 3 presidents in 2 weeks. Peru was able to issue 10-year bonds in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of chaos. Israel, I think, issued a 100-year bond, not for a huge amount, but I'm just making the point. This is completely different than the 1980s. So these countries didn't say, "Oh yeah, let's print money." No. They learned their lesson in the 1980s. There's no way they did that. They issued it by financing debt. And why is debt? Well, and they had some credibility to say, okay, yeah, they're not going to default on the debt. They'll raise taxes at some point in the future. So I think that's really important to recognize. And that's why a country like Argentina, which does not have that domestic debt market for reasons that, we probably all know pretty well, why in Argentina we have 100% inflation now, right? Because everyone knew, characterizing it, pandemic, government spending is going to go up. How is that going to happen? Well, money creation. So people see that and they immediately know, what's going to happen. Whereas if you have a domestic debt market, you can attenuate that process and you can eventually, you could smooth it out. So in the US, this was a very temporary phenomenon. And really it was, the timing is such that the Fed could go out in the market and buy long-term debt, right, with reserves before the CARES Act was passed, right? The Treasury couldn't borrow because it didn't have the legal authority to borrow. And so essentially the Fed went out, bought all this long-term debt with, reserves, interest, overnight floating rate debt. And then once the CARES Act was approved, the Treasury started issuing a tremendous amount of bills, short-term debt. And they were able to issue all that tremendous amount of debt out of nowhere because the Fed had, kind of front run them by issuing all those reserves. So very quickly, the Treasury, by issuing the Treasury bill, short-term debt, was able to build up a balance at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York of about $1.8 trillion by the end of July 2020, which is an incredible amount.
And that's what we call the TGA when people study the Fed's balance sheet that we all focus on these days.
So for people, who are not familiar, what would be the normal amount of the TGA? Before the GFC, it was $5 billion.
5 billion.
Yeah, it's a very, very tiny amount. Treasury manages cash very closely. Maybe before this happened, because after the GFC, some treasuries started building up balances at the central bank in case they were shut out of markets. This is kind of implausible in the US, but the US, had that argument. Canada also built up its deposit at the Bank of Canada, the government, for this same kind of precautionary motive. So maybe it was 300 billion before the pandemic at the Treasury. So this is a tremendous amount of funds. So so I think that was great, right? That was terrific. The Fed facilitated this incredible increase in borrowing by the Treasury and enabled the Treasury to kind of build this reserve in the face of the pandemic, which who knows, no one knew, right? What the Treasury would have to spend. And the Treasury rightfully spent this money very fast, right? So one of the differences between this and the global financial crisis was that the Obama administration did do some fiscal action, but it was kind of long-term infrastructure, was very kind of, it didn't really get into the economy very fast and was very small. In this case, and we're going to get back to what causes inflation, you had a very huge fiscal expansion, and it was in cash, right? People got checks, people didn't have to pay their taxes. And it is very important that the Treasury said, by the way, we're not going to tax these checks. Okay. So this is a bit like if you want to talk about helicopter money, helicopter money is not giving people, $1,000 and then saying, oh, tomorrow, oh, by the way, you have to pay $500 in taxes on that. No, the effectiveness of stimulus is you give them a check and say, you'll never have to pay taxes on it again. Right. So all of this was a massive fiscal expansion that had to be financed immediately because it had to be spent quickly. So that's the end of the good part of the story. Okay, so what is the failure, in my opinion? And I think it's pretty reasonable, is that the Fed continued to buy long-term Treasury debt and financing that with short-term, overnight interest on reserves. And it was kind of a joint failure of the Treasury and the Fed in the sense that what the Treasury should have done, once it had built up this reserve of $1.8 trillion to have started to, as those treasury bills mature, start issuing long-term debt. Okay. Which, by the way, is what all the corporates in America were doing, because long-term debt was at historically low rates. It's what many mortgage holders were doing, refinancing their mortgage, extending their duration at historically low interest rates, probably the lowest rates we'll see in certainly my lifetime. And certain sovereigns like Canada were explicitly saying, yeah, we're going to lengthen the maturity of our debt because interest rates are so low. We're going to take advantage of that. So the US Treasury did not do that, which was, I think with hindsight, obviously a terrible mistake, but with foresight, it didn't make sense. It's like you have a ill family member or your car breaks down and you have to borrow $20,000 on your credit card. That's a good thing to do. But once you've done that and finance it, it's time to find a cheaper, longer term way of financing that, getting a home equity line of credit or what have you. So it's a very straightforward thing. The Treasury did not do that. You could say, well, it's the Fed's fault because the Treasury might have been trying to do that. But the Fed was out there buying the long-term debt and replacing it with the short-term debt. So I think that was a big mistake, sort of combined Fed Treasury of not extending maturities in that time period once they had really obtained the financing with the short-term instruments. So I've done I'm working on a paper. It's called "Why Should the Fed Have Lost $1 Trillion?" And it's based on the fact that during 2022, the unrealized losses on the Fed security portfolio increased by $1.2 trillion. So the Fed increased its unrealized losses by $1.2 trillion during 2022. And breaking that down, about 800 billion of that are losses on the Treasury securities. And about 400 billion are losses on the mortgage-backed securities. Now, I actually think the policy on the mortgage-backed securities is much worse than the policy with the Treasury securities, the failure to lengthen maturities when there was an opportunity to do so. So what happened with the mortgage-backed securities? So again, when the pandemic started, the mortgage market kind of stopped functioning. And as other people might know, the date from sort of agreeing on buying a house and the closing and that mortgage being funded and wrapped up with other mortgages into a security might be something like 90 days, right? Between the time it sort of goes through the factory and gets manufactured and sold. So basically the demand for those securities dried up. And so the whole system was going to freeze like a stopping conveyor belt, right? It's just was not going to function. So it made sense for the Fed to come in and say, look, we were going to step in and essentially take care of all these mortgages that are in the pipeline. And however the Fed phrased it, the fact is that during the first quarter of this policy, the Fed actually bought more than 100% of all the mortgages that were originated in the United States during that period. So not only did it buy everything in the pipeline, but it even bought more.
Wow.
Okay. I don't have a problem with that. I can understand this is a classic market, freezing. The Fed comes in and stops it. But then the Fed continued with a policy, and the policy was very poorly designed, in my opinion, because it basically said, we are going to reinvest all of the principal payments that we receive on the portfolio of MBS that we have. And on top of that, buy more. So the first part of that basically said, sort of with a loudspeaker, anyone in America who wants to refinance your mortgage with me is welcome to do so. Right. And what happened? Well, during the pandemic, right? I hope it's not people can still remember what it was like during 2020. 2020 witnessed the highest volume of mortgage originations in United States history. It's phenomenal. You say, what? What? In the middle of the pandemic? I mean, I know what I was thinking in the middle of the pandemic. You're just wondering, like, how are we going to get to the end of the pandemic? But what happened was the Fed, by basically announcing this, like, I will be there, fostered, of course, interest rates collapsed to the lowest level in history. And so people refinance mortgages at a record rate, taking advantage of this lifetime opportunity. So what was the benefit of this? Like, did this stimulate the economy? What did this do? The cut to the chase is, it basically took $400 billion out of the pockets of the American taxpayer and gave it to the wealthy segment of the population, who are the homeowners, not the renters. And if you look at the Fed data, people with the highest mortgages, the largest mortgages, which are presumably the wealthiest people, had the highest percentage of refinancing, right? So basically, of the mortgages that the Fed bought, by the way, during this period 2020, 2021, over 70% were reinvestments of principal that the Fed received. In other words, were refinancings of mortgages. So 70%.
So just to be clear, what happened then was the Fed essentially backstopped the entire mortgage market. And not only that, it basically told all homeowners that they could refinance at incredibly attractive rates. And homeowners, especially ones with large mortgages, are the richer end. So as you say, it's transfer of wealth from the average taxpayer to the wealthy through this mortgage refinancing channel.
Right. So basically, and if you look at the Fed's portfolio, which I have, the average coupons on those, basically the Fed rolled over, it's very important to realize with treasuries, right, there's no prepayment possibility, right? And
yeah,
you probably have people following you all over the world. In the United States, you can prepay your mortgage without any penalty. So when interest rates fall, people who have the ability to do so will get a new mortgage at a lower rate and prepay their old mortgage. So that's absolutely, that's American tradition or convention, what have you. So what happens is that, there's a massive amount of prepayments because you have lowered rates. Like the policy was to inadvertently lowered mortgage rates, the lowest rates in history. And you had people refinancing with you. And in a world where you didn't really need excess demand because you couldn't spend the money, right? So you had this sort of stimulus going into asset prices, including housing prices. So it was a very bad financial decision by the Fed. Okay, it lost $400 billion. It was a very bad policy because it pushed housing prices up. There were house prices in the U.S. The Case-Shiller rose by about 17.5% per annum for 2.25 years. So again, the wealthy people who own homes, this is fantastic. The value of the property rose in real terms. The value of the mortgages collapsed in real terms, especially when inflation kicked up. And it was a terrible, I would say, distributional policy, right? Because the renters are definitely the poorest part of the population. The people who had lost their jobs or whatever, I don't think they could refinance their mortgages at that time. So it was very skewed towards a sector of the population that doesn't have a high margin of propensity to consume. And during the pandemic, well, they couldn't consume even if they wanted to. So it was a very bad sort of distributional policy as well. And last time to belabor this point, inflation of rent has risen higher than average inflation, right? So the pushing up property prices and rents and inflation has hurt the poor, not only in that they didn't get this great.
They didn't get the wealth gain,
benefit.
and instead the outgoings go up as well.
So the CPI rent of your primary residence was annual rate 8.5% in December of last year. That's when I checked the number for the paper. So basically, the answer to the rhetorical question, should the Fed have lost $1 trillion? No, it shouldn't. But it's not that it could have lost money, but still had a good policy impact. But I don't think it was.
And just a question on losing money. Does it matter? I mean, just in terms of credibility of a central bank, that they do carry large unrealized losses or realized losses? I mean, does it matter the P&L of a central bank or not?
Right. So there's two ways to look at this. One is the economic and one is the political. So I'm an economist. Let me talk about the economics of it first. So basically, unlike a private company, zero equity, negative equity don't mean it much for a central bank. Now, some people say, well, that's because the central bank can print all the money it wants. So of course, central bank losses don't matter. That's really silly. I mean, it's really silly, but a lot of people say things like this. And I would say any child understands that this is not true. In many cultures, we have different stories. The story in the U.S. Anglo story, the goose that lays the golden eggs. Okay, we all know that as a child, right? Farmer says, "Oh, the goose is laying golden eggs. Let's make it lay more and more and more, and eventually the goose dies." Okay, so the point is, yes, government could always raise taxes and put you in jail if you don't pay taxes, but that doesn't mean it can raise an infinite amount of real resources, taxes. The central bank can print up pieces of paper all it wants. That doesn't mean that there's no limit to the real resources the central bank can obtain. So that sort of, I would say, puerile explanation of why central bank negative equity or losses don't matter is silly and completely wrong. So what is when do central bank losses matter? So I'll give the answer to that question. So they matter when they attain a size where they interfere with the central bank's ability to achieve its policy objective. Okay, so I developed the concept that I call policy solvency to distinguish it from financial solvency. So the central bank is policy insolvent when its losses are so high that it can't achieve its inflation target. Okay. So that point depends on, how committed it is to an inflation target, how low the inflation target is. It depends on the circumstances of the economy, depends on the credibility of the central bank, depends on a lot of factors. But let's say this is when it matters. It's when it becomes a problem for obtaining your objectives. So in my opinion, and by the way, I might have looked at this issue more than anyone in the world, just because I did this at the UNA starting in the 1980s. And so I think I should have some credibility to make this statement. So in the advanced countries, I'm not worried that the losses are going to basically prevent central banks from raising interest rates or doing what they have to do to control inflation. Now, in other countries, okay, Argentina again, we're already past the point where central bank losses are in other words, inflation. The target for inflation in Argentina right now is about 100%. And yes, they can barely achieve that with the losses that they're making, right? But they couldn't achieve a 2% target, okay? So the point is, you really have to look at the situation. So I don't think, while theoretically and in practice, many central banks have been prevented from achieving their objectives. And the most obvious one is if you have a fixed exchange rate, right? If you have a fixed exchange rate, then your balance sheet has to be able to, meet that very strong commitment, right? To not devalue. But basically, you can look at its inflation target. So you could have a country that has losses that enable you to achieve, let's say, 15% inflation target, but not a 5% inflation target. So to get to 5% inflation, you need to be recapitalized or
Okay. Again.
So now let's go to the political side, which is more, I think, relevant for our sort of advanced country peer group. I sometimes put advanced in the quotation mark because I think they're not behaving as well as some of the emerging markets that I mentioned before. So what is the political problem? So there are, different shades of this. So one shade would be that treasuries realize, so the Fed basically will not pay any the treasuries have been getting about $100 billion in dividends from the Fed every year for a decade or so. And now the Fed will not be giving a dividend to the treasury for, who knows how long, 3, 4, 5 years. It depends on who you believe. So you can imagine a treasury in that circumstance thinking, well, I'm not too happy about this. This is a lot of money that I was getting. I'm not getting it now. And I say you made a terrible mistake and I'm going to take away your monetary policy independence. Like I'm going to take over monetary policy, which of course would be a pretty big disaster. So that's one thing, just like blaming them for, it's the, I was thinking in Spanish of finding a scapegoat, right, for this problem that, is not really their fault, potentially. The other one is to actually interfere with the execution of policy or the instruments. So very obvious, I don't want to suggest this for anyone who hasn't thought of it, would be the Treasury to tell the Fed, look, you've got to stop paying interest on reserves. Right. And I know there was a discussion in Parliament, the UK Parliament, about just this sort of idea where some academics, were saying, well, this is a risk. The Bank of England, might be put under political pressure not to raise rates because of the losses that will obtain. And it's interesting, in the UK, the Treasury had indemnified the Bank of England against losses. So the UK Treasury is actually now transferring cash to the Bank of England. So there's a cash flow in the opposite direction, right? So that makes it even more painful for the Treasury, right? Not only are they not getting a dividend, but they're actually having to identify expenditures. Significant amount of money is going to the Bank of England. So that would be another risk. Now I want to mention one other risk, which is a bit more subtle, but I've seen in many countries happen that have central bank negative equity for a long period of time. And that is treasuries begin to realize, so the Treasury doesn't want to recapitalize the central bank. Let's forget about that. But basically they said, the central bank's has had negative equity for a long time. We haven't been getting dividends for a long time. And it's not likely that we're going to get dividends at any likely future time. So let's think of how we could take advantage of this. And they developed a predilection for what, we called at the IMF. I worked on this also back in the 80s, still working on it now, quasi-fiscal expenditures of central bank. So it's basically saying, finding a way to have the central bank finance spending that should be done by the Treasury. Okay. So you put it off budget and you have the central bank do it. So what happens? The central bank losses go up, right? So it would be like subsidized lending, right? Saying to the Fed, look, yeah, there are all these green projects or green bonds, lend to them at zero, right? Like it's something that the government should decide. The government should put it in the budget. Government should do the cost benefit analysis. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Is it also the Fed buying mortgages is the same thing?
It could be if the Treasury was saying, hey, yeah, you do this.
Yeah. So the issue here is who's
for
deciding
our sort of fiscal purposes as opposed to monetary purposes.
Okay. Yeah.
So you're right. So what happens is that the central bank losses get larger, but since the central bank wasn't paying any dividends to the Treasury, there's no really impact on the government budget as conventionally defined. So that's why back in the 80s, I wrote a paper with David Robinson called Amalgamating Central Bank and Fiscal Deficits, because we at the IMF were saying, look, all these countries, the conventional deficit is small, relatively small. Where's all this inflation coming from? Well, what is going on here? And we tied it to the quasi-fiscal losses of the central banks. And by the way, it wasn't our IMF idea. It was actually, there was a conference in Latin America about 1982, and all the papers were written by central bankers, and they were saying, look, we can't do our thing. We can't execute our policy. We're really constrained by these quasi-fiscal losses. And my boss at the time, Mario Bleher, who was a pretty well-known academic, he was became eventually head of the Central Bank of Argentina. He's spent time at the Bank of England. He came back from the conference, and Mario is Argentine, so Spanish speaker. He came back and he threw all these pamphlets. Remember, this is before the internet. He threw all these papers in physical form down on his desk and said to me and David and a few other people said, I just went to this conference. This is great. We need to do something about this. And I think he wanted to assign this is again luck, right, of my life. He wanted to assign it to David Robinson, who eventually, was a very capable guy, became the deputy director of the research department at the IMF at some point. But he was a very young guy, we're all very young. So I think he wanted to assign it to David, but David didn't read Spanish, and I did. So I kind of, my way is, let's write this paper together. So that's where I got started on the quasi-fiscal thing. So, I think, the IMF can take credit for pursuing this, but it was actually coming from the countries themselves. They had identified this as a problem. Now, I want to mention kind of an anecdote just to make my point. So not too long ago, maybe a decade ago, I was at a central bank. They had been losses for a long time, negative equity for a long time. And the governor said to me, we have all this problem because the government is constantly trying to introduce legislation to make us bear expenses. And he said to me, the latest is that they were going to propose legislation to make us, the central bank, responsible for funding the National Olympic team.
Hey.
So that's an example. And if you think, oh, that only happens in strange countries. Well, Dodd-Frank, in the 1,000 pages of Dodd-Frank, the Consumer Protection Bureau, I forget exactly what it's called, was set up. And it's kind of an independent agency. But the funding for that agency is paid out of the Fed net income. So that's an example.
Okay, interesting.
That's an example of legislation sort of assigning what really should be fiscal expenditures to the central bank, which is a way to keep them out of the budget scoring. So that's I don't think that's when I really worry about central bank losses in a context where it's not an economic problem, because of my vast experience with this trend towards quasi-fiscal spending. And
now I did want to, we could, there's so much more we can talk about, but I'm cognizant of time here. I did want to round off our economic discussion here with what worries you the most about the Fed's balance sheet today?
So I would say, so actually the political problems I mentioned were all negative.
Yeah.
But I think there's a political problem that would be a positive thing. And that is to look at what the Fed has done and to say, unfortunately, and I've been talking about this for a long time, so I'm not a Monday morning quarterback on this, please realize this. But I remember saying to one of my deputies when the global financial crisis started, I was still at the IMF. He was actually a former central bank governor. I said to him, Luis, when the Fed started to do these sort of set up the made 'em late things and do these really kind of dodgy things, I said, Luis, if the Fed winds up making money, nobody's going to care. But if they lose money, then people are going to care. Now, that's completely intellectually wrong, because you should say, look, this is, again, this question is it good? Judging the quality of the decision by the outcome, but this is the way people tend to work. So what's happened? What happened? We had, 13, 15 years where the Fed was making money and doing all this stuff. Of course, nobody complained. Now, $1.2 trillion loss. Now people are going to complain. So unfortunately, we're only probably going to get to this stage now, as opposed to having preventing it. So what is this? It's really a fundamental question. And I think you alluded to it earlier in one of your remarks. What is the appropriate governance structure of these operations? Okay. Should they be under the Treasury? Should they be under the central bank? Or should they be, as I proposed in at a BIS conference, should there be a third institution set up with kind of a hybrid governance structure to do these, let's say, heterodox authorizations? Set up an entity with its own balance sheet, its own capital, its own law to deal with, let's say, intervening in the mortgage market. Okay. That paper is called Minimizing Monetary Policy. And it basically argues, to achieve this overnight interest rate target, you can have a really small balance sheet, really small. And the central banks did have really small balance sheets. So the question is, what is the appropriate governance structure for this thing? So the IMF recently, we came out with a couple of, so I did consulting for the IMF, papers on quasi-fiscal operations of central banks during crisis situations. And the real issue is, in our view, I think it's the right view, what the Fed has done has created fiscal risk. It's a fiscal risk, right? What I was talking about.
Yeah.
Changing the maturity structure of the debt. Well, that should be the responsibility of the debt managers of the Treasury in any country, right? So the Fed kind of shortened the duration and did these things. It didn't have to do that. It could have done it in a different way, but it did that. And if you say, well, that's a new policy tool, and well, there has to be some cooperation between the Treasury and the Fed on this, right? And on the mortgage-backed securities, again, this was, I would say, a quasi-fiscal operation. And we need to think about this. Should the Treasury be doing this, or should the Fed be doing this? Or should someone else be doing this? And we have a very good example. So we have a lot of cross-country experience on different ways of doing it. So the way the US did it is not the only way. UK did it in a different way. Norway did it in a different way, and in a better way, in my opinion. Canada did it in a different way, a better way, in my opinion. Like keeping it off the balance sheet of the central bank. Right, so the Treasury wound up doing this. And in the US, going back to the Bush administration, there was actually a law passed which enabled the Treasury to buy agency debt and mortgage-backed securities. I forget exactly what the name. It's like to protect the American Homeowner Act, something like that, a nice name. Now, a year later, the Fed was basically doing exactly the same thing, but under a completely different governance structure. What do I mean by that? When the Treasury does something like that, number one, has to pass a law, Congress has to approve it. And given an authorization for a specific amount of spending or asset acquisition. Number two, the Treasury has to finance that with debt, right? It has to issue debt to get the cash to buy the mortgage-backed securities. And you're subject to the debt limit. I'm not a big fan of the debt limit, but sometimes it can play a role. And this was the case. I'll get to that in a minute. Third, there was political cost to pay by the government. It had to declare sort of a state of emergency and so on and so forth. Right? It had to report to Congress regularly on this. When the Fed did it, okay, it's just a decision of the FOMC. Right? You didn't need a law. You didn't need to put a cap on it, a limit on it, a target on it. You didn't have any financing constraint, right? Create an infinite amount of money. By the way, I was in class when Ben Bernanke, he's known as Helicopter Ben. I was in class, it was 1979, I think, where he said, yeah, the central bank can, create an infinite amount of money, no problem. And I already knew that, but there were a lot of people who had studied engineering, like in math, in undergrad, and they were looking, I could see them looking at each other like, is this guy nuts? Like, this can't be possibly true. But then they scribbled it in their notebooks because they figured, well, he's going to be writing the exam, so I better write it down. Anyway, so it's a very, very different, completely different governance structure. Now you say, well, does that really matter? Well, yes, it does matter, because when we transitioned to about 2011, 2010, now it's Obama administration and they're running up against the debt limit. Okay. And when you run up against the debt limit, well, first you have to run down your deposits. And then you look at, oh yeah, we have all these mortgage-backed securities on our balance sheet. We have to sell them. We have to sell them, generate cash, right? To enable us to spend and still stay under the debt limit, right? Or we could, in fact, that law that I mentioned, it said that the proceeds of selling those securities by the government had to be used to repay debt, actually. Yeah, now I remember. So basically the debt limit and the governance structure of the Treasury forced the Treasury in 2011, 2012 to hire investment managers, Deutsche Bank, I forget who, BlackRock, to hold auctions of these securities. So all of the securities that were bought were sold. Now, contrast that with the Fed, which at some point, Ben Bernanke, everyone was talking about shrinking the balance sheet, getting rid of these assets. Well, never happened. It just kept going up and up and up. And that's what I mean about the difference in the governance structures enabling something to happen, under the Fed roof that couldn't have happened on the Treasury roof. And my question is, does that make sense? Does it make sense to have the same thing going on under different governance structures? Either one is better than the other, or there's a third way that's better. It just doesn't make sense to have it.
No, that's great. That's a great point, actually. And there's a great contrast to show. And I think something for all of us to think about, including policymakers. Now, I did want to round off our conversation with a few personal questions. One of which was, some of our audience are relatively young. They're at university or school. They're going to leave and join the job market. So what advice would you give to young people leaving university today as they enter the real world?
So I would first recommend watching Michael Lewis, the author, his commencement address at Princeton in 2012. I think it was fantastic. He was an art history major at Princeton. And the theme of his talk is really kind of the antidote to, I would say, the founder of Apple, I forget his name. Steve Jobs' Stanford address.
Yeah.
So Michael Lewis' address was all about how lucky he was, how fortunate he was, and how everyone graduating from Princeton should be grateful for the good fortune they've had. Either their parents, where they were born, somebody helped them along the way. And it's a very interesting story because he goes through his own life and you see, yeah, it was just by chance that he wound up writing Liar's Poker and all these other books. And he said, and look at those who were not so lucky. And be generous towards them, or be humble. Don't think, oh, I'm graduated from Princeton. I'm like so smart and I deserve everything I get. No, actually, you're really lucky. And don't overestimate that. So that's kind of a personal advice. The other thing is, I mentioned this. It's you might think it's tongue in cheek, but it's real. I probably should have dropped out of Stanford. I should have quit. But the reason I didn't wasn't because of some brilliant calculation. It's because I was afraid. I didn't have the courage to, give up and like face failure and do something. And to have been so young, like that's a terrible mistake. I could have done lots of others. I might have made bigger mistakes. I'm not saying that, right? But when you're young, don't be afraid to change courses. You're probably going to have several careers during your life anyway. So I don't say give up immediately, but if you really feel you're at a dead end, don't be afraid to change course. The third thing is a bit again, old person talking, right? Read books, and associate with human beings in person. Don't get caught up on the internet. Of course, it's a great resource, but don't get sort of wrapped up in social media with your own group. So, people who are following this, they might, form an investment club with your friends. People are interested in macro. I tried to do this, it didn't work, but, I was very interested in cyber currencies and understanding all this. And I thought, let me start watching the lectures on this and get a group of friends, and, we'll talk about it. We'll exchange ideas about it. Or even if it's a sport, just keep that human contact. I think it's very valuable. And I again, maybe it's an old person talking, but I'm a little afraid that people are getting or losing that sort of interaction.
No, that's an excellent point. And you mentioned books. Are there any books that really influenced you?
So here's a book that I definitely recommend for young people. It's called Peak. I think it's called The Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. And it's written by Anders Ericsson. And you might, a lot of people might have heard of this idea that came out of Malcolm Gladwell, the idea that with 10,000 hours of practice, anyone can be an expert in anything. And this book was actually written by the author of the research that Malcolm Gladwell referred to. And he's kind of upset because Malcolm Gladwell didn't get the point of the book. So he wrote the book. And so his point is, it's a very special kind of practice. It's purposeful practice. And practice is not just like repetition. It's working on your weak points, pushing yourself. It's called purposeful practice. And it's the stories, the research that he talks about, it's really fascinating. If you really want to develop expertise in basically any walk of life, there's really some good, exciting guidance there. And even if you have children, in other words, what is effective in educating people. So his big bottom line is there's no such thing as natural talent. Absolutely no such thing. Mozart did not have natural talent. You can argue with that. I mean, he explains why. His sister was a virtuoso musician and his father was a music teacher or what have you. So he's claiming that he was subject to this purposeful practice and he did the 10,000 hours by the time he was, 10 years old or something. So you can believe that or not believe that, but there's really a lot of interesting evidence about how to improve your performance or learn in the most effective way. So I'd highly recommend that. Another book that might be interesting for the audience is I believe it's called Superforecasting.
By Tetlock. Yeah.
Do you know that book? I think that's really interesting in terms of what makes a good decision maker. And by the way, there are themes that are common in those two books, and one of them is getting good and quick feedback. That's a key to improving, like getting, constructive criticism in a timely way. And something I would say to young people, again, one thing that surprised me, when you leave school, you're used to getting a lot of exams and tests and feedback. And when you get into the I would say the corporate world, or at the IMF, or even in academia, it's very hard to get people to give you sort of feedback, constructive feedback. People are so involved with their own careers. And if you're a manager, it's an awkward thing, right, to deliver what could be perceived as criticism. So I went through a lot of periods like not getting feedback. And then when I did get feedback, I really acted on it. I think it was really terrific. So that's something to seek out, which again, you might get from these groups of friends or clubs that you're in. You might not get it professionally, but you might get it from people who know how to give you advice. So Bilal, maybe you'll tell me, Peter, you could have done a much better job by A, B, and C during the podcast. So that's something that people frequently don't get. And that's a big element in the book Peak, and a big element, I think, in the Superforecasting.
There's a great, two great, fantastic recommendations. And finally, what's the best way for people to follow your work or follow you in general?
So I have a website. It's called Central Bank Archaeology. So I do put things on there, and on LinkedIn occasionally. I'm not too good about posting things, and there's a lot of things I've written that I haven't put on the website, which I probably should do at some point. But that would be the best way.
Okay, that's excellent. I'll include the links on the show note as well, and also you referenced one or two papers as well. I'll include those on the show notes as well. So with that, thanks a lot, Peter. It was fantastic speaking to you. We could have spent much longer talking, but hopefully we'll have you back again to continue our conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was great.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.